For a conversation about investing in ideas, please welcome Dr. Yvonne Greenstreet, the Chief Operating Officer of Alnylam biotech company based in Kendall Square. Robert Atkinson, founder and president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. And joining us via Skype, please welcome Abbie Celniker, partner at Third Rock Ventures. Here to lead the conversation, please welcome the Atlantic's Olga Khazan.
Thank you guys so much for coming. Thank you. So we're here to talk about one of the leading innovation industries in the US, which is biotech and life sciences startups. I'm here with a biotech entrepreneur, a venture capitalist, and an innovation expert. And I just wanted to start with you, Abbie. Maybe you could just tell us what is life sciences? What falls under that umbrella?
So currently a lot falls under the umbrella of life sciences. I think that we're used to it being the pharmaceutical industry, the diagnostic industry, biotech, and medical devices. But now, more and more, you're seeing digital health fall under life sciences, and even some very interesting convergence between all of those areas. So it's really a very broad spectrum of technology and innovation that falls under that category.
And what do you look for when you're investing in a biotech startup?
I'm sorry, I heard, what do you look for? And then it broke up.
Assume that you were... what do you look for when you're investing in a company? What aspects do you look for?
So Third Rock is a little bit of a different type of venture capital firm. What we really look for, number one, is whether or not we're going to achieve unmet need for patients. Are we going to invest in something that will result in innovation that will really change the lives of patients and their families? So that's the first thing. There's a big unmet need and something really transformative and potentially disruptive. We're also very interested in looking at technology and innovation where we can really be very patient-centric from the patient segmentation and selection criteria. Again, really understanding who should be receiving the therapies and innovative treatments that we are developing. And sometimes that's really supported by a combination of diagnostic and therapeutic development. So we're really looking, again, from a patient-centric perspective, how can we create value for the patients as well as create value for the people who take the risks to be innovators in our industry.
And Yvonne, you're actually down there in the trenches working to bring these breakthroughs to the public. Tell us a little bit about your company and what you're working on.
Yeah, so I'm Chief Operating Officer for Alnylam Pharmaceuticals, which is an incredibly exciting company that was founded on this really bold vision based on Nobel Prize-winning science with a technology that has the ability to silence genes which result in disease-causing proteins. And it really has been kind of the classical story of the growth of a biotech company from the very early days, where it was really just about the science and trying to understand how you could apply the science to the clinical setting, to where we are now, which is on the cusp of actually bringing the first medicine from this RNAi technology to patients. A very exciting time.
And what is the technology?
The technology is a technology, as I said, that's able to target specific disease-causing genes and preventing the production of abnormal proteins from those genes. And it really has been a very long journey. It's a little bit like sending a rocket to the moon. It's an expensive endeavor, it's high risk, and it takes a lot of time. So Alnylam's had this 16-year journey of the ups and downs of building a biotech company, having to raise capital. We've raised something like $4 billion of investments. We've deployed about $2.5 billion of that over the last several years. We've had to establish the intellectual property estate to make sure that we have a proposition that is attractive to investors. And just like Abbie said, we focused on really transformational medicines that have the ability to really impact on patients' lives. And our lead medicine is actually called patisiran. We're expecting approval over the summer, and this is a medicine for a condition called hATTR amyloidosis. It's a rare condition, very debilitating, results in death. And we've been able to show with this medicine that we can actually, in many patients, halt the progression of the disease. They tend to, move towards, being able to walk, to needing a cane, to being wheelchair bound before they die. And we're able to show with this medicine that we can either halt progression or reverse the disease. So it's pretty exciting times, but it's been a very, very long journey to get us here.
And for those of us who don't know, what is the life cycle of a biotech startup? What do you have to go through to actually go from idea to product?
Right. Well, I'd like to, Abbie will probably have some views on this as well. I'm actually, just to give you a bit about my background, I'm a fairly recent transplant to biotech. I'm a physician by training, but I've spent much of my career actually in large pharma, where I think you get kind of exposure to a very broad portfolio of activities. It's incredible training, but lacks perhaps the nimbleness and ability to move rapidly that maybe a smaller company does, just given the size and the need to kind of have governance processes and committees. And I found the transition to biotech incredibly liberating, actually, where you have a smaller group of people that can make decisions quickly and really focus on what I think that the two most important drivers in our business, which is having incredible science. And as I described to you, our science was Nobel Prize winning, but really having this patient-focused mindset where the drive is to try to identify diseases where there's significant medical need and address that need. And the company's grown from a couple of employees back in 2002 to now we're just a shade under 1,000 people, not just this medicine that's coming to market to patients over the summer, but this incredibly rich pipeline of medicines based on this technology that we'll be able to bring to patients over the next several years. So we've grown from a couple of employees to shade under 1,000 to basically a few lab-based experiments to now larger studies in patients, from an organization that was essentially based around research and then development to now one that's had to build the commercial capability that's required to actually translate these exciting scientific ideas to real patient impact.
Yeah. And Rob, you have a slightly different view on this, which is that you think startups are great, but they have some limitations. Tell us about your new book and some of the ideas in it.
I always want to talk about my new book, which you can get on $9 now on Barnes & Noble used. I looked today. The book is with a colleague of mine, Mike Lind, and it's called Big is Beautiful, Debunking the Myth of Small Business. And actually, to be fair, what we really talk about is run-of-the-mill mom and pop small businesses, frankly, aren't all that important to the U.S. economy. They don't drive innovation or growth. There are two big parts of the U.S. economy that are important. One are startups, high-tech startups like what you're talking about, and the other are big companies like Eli Lilly. We just finished a study late last year at ITIF where we looked at a data set of over 6 million firms, startup firms, and including in the life sciences industry. And one of the things we found is there are actually a lot more life science startups today than there were 10 years ago. So just contrary to sort of the stories that you kind of hear about big companies dominating. Second, the vast majority of life sciences firms, biopharma firms, are actually pre-revenue. They don't make any money. And that goes to the whole point of risk, is why are investors putting money into that if they're not making any money? Because they think that maybe they're going to get lucky. The drug will work, it'll get approved, and they'll make some money, and they'll get a patent and be able to recoup all of that money they've spent ahead of time.
And how much should we be spending on innovation? How do we keep some of these breakthroughs flowing?
Most of the debates we have about life sciences, whether it's the patents are too strong or too weak, or should we have price controls, or all of those things, they really boil down to one fundamental question, which is how much societal resources should we be putting into the future? This is not a debate about somebody said earlier today about the interest of inventors versus the interest of the public. This is a debate about the interest of our children versus today. That's really what this debate is about. There's a very good study that the OECD did a few years ago where they said they found essentially a one-to-one correlation between the revenues in the life sciences industry and the amount of R&D that's invested. None of this innovation happens without R&D. You have a laboratory, you have scientists, they're working in labs, that's R&D. You don't develop new drugs without R&D. The US, by the way, the US industry invests about $80 billion every year in R&D. The US companies, biopharma companies, invest more in R&D as a share of what's called value added than any industry in the US and any industry in the world. That's why we're in the lead, and I think that's really important to understand that we're essentially putting money in now, and it feels painful certainly with drug prices. We're putting money in now. But the reason we're putting money in now is so that we can have better drugs and treatments for our children.
And actually, I'd just like to chip in there because, remember, I think it plays back to some of the earlier conversation that there's a limited period of time when an innovator can actually reap the rewards of the incredible risk that's been taken, the incredible capital that's been deployed. And then after that time, those medicines are essentially a gift to society once they become generic. So I think the whole ecosystem is very carefully structured and balanced to try to get this system working where innovators are incentivized to come up with some of these breakthrough therapies, and society is able to avail themselves of those opportunities. It's actually quite a delicate balance.
But what do you say to people who argue that the salaries of pharma CEOs are way too high, and that some of this protection of innovation is not really necessary, that actually it's overly protected and they get too many benefits for what
I'll give you what I think is a really good example, the whole area of developing antibiotics. And as you know, we're experiencing society seeing more and more resistance to antibiotics. And because of the way antibiotics are managed appropriately from medical perspective, you don't want to overuse antibiotics. Actually, if you have an effective antibiotic that's effective against a resistant organism, you actually want to minimize the use of that antibiotic to protect it, if you like, for the future. Well, that means that the traditional model of the reward that you get for bringing a medicine to society is based on the use of that medicine in society, and yet you don't want to use the antibiotics, and therefore there hasn't been the reward associated with antibiotic R&D, and therefore what we've seen over the last several years is actually hardly any innovation being driven in that area, and I think that speaks to the importance of needing to have rewards to incentivize innovators to focus on important conditions. I don't know, Abbie, if you want to.
Yeah, I was gonna, if I can jump in. I know it's hard when I'm on the screen here, so I apologize. I keep trying here. But a couple of things. So exactly what Yvonne said, I think, is correct. There's a tremendous amount of risk in our industry, and that risk translates into, and I think most people have heard these numbers, probably less than 10% of the original ideas ever translating into an approved product. So with that kind of attrition, it takes a lot of fortitude and commitment to continue to innovate for people like we just saw Roxanne at the beginning of the session here. So what it takes to give people the incentive to continue to break through the barriers and innovate and be creative and be disruptive and find solutions rather than quit. Because when you have a failure rate like that, sometimes people do just say it's not worth it. You have to keep those patients in mind, and you have to keep pushing through, but you also have to incentivize the executives who make the difficult decisions to support a program knowing that there's a high likelihood that it won't succeed. And maybe to add to one of the former questions about the life cycle, a life cycle for drug development is usually in the 15-year range for a new therapeutic. We've really had some fortunate opportunities in the past, I would say 10 years or so. One of our portfolio companies, Agios, was able to sort of beat the timelines, and in about 9 years from the discovery of a target to the launch of a drug for patients with AML, they were able to get this drug developed, and it was sort of this scrappy, focused, urgent sort of culture that Yvonne had mentioned that allowed that to happen. But that was also because it was in an oncology indication with huge unmet need. There are other more primary care or more focused areas that it does take longer because the clinical trials take longer, demonstrating safety takes longer. And now in the future, when we think about the opportunity to actually demonstrate value, which is something that we know as an industry we're going to have to be able to do, because value-based pricing is something that we're hearing a lot about, and we're interested in making it work. We're going to have to be able to invest in studies that include outcomes, which take a lot longer than just the studies that demonstrate efficacy. So what you can see with all of that is that it's a relatively long life cycle, so you want people to stay committed. It's a high level of risk, so you have to incent people to take that risk. And those things add up to the current, sort of equation that we have, which has actually been pretty successful in creating these highly innovative therapies and transforming the lives of many patients.
And so you mentioned the antibiotics example, which is a really good one, which a lot of these companies feel like there's not enough incentives in order to put out newer antibiotics. What should the role of the federal government be, or what's the backstop for that?
So I can answer. I just also quickly want to respond to your point about the CEO notion. CEO compensation in the biopharma industry is no different than any other industry. If you really want to deal with this issue, one of the points we make in our book, there's a good study that showed that if you add up all the compensation of the Fortune 500 CEOs, it's smaller than the 15 largest, highest paid hedge fund managers. So you really want to talk about where the money's going in the economy. It is not CEOs, it's not companies that are actually making things, including in this industry. I think when you talk about the role of government, the US biopharmaceutical industry produces 57% of all the new drugs in the world. Why is that? We're not 57% of the market. Why doesn't Europe produce more? The answer is very simple, is when you're a European company, you just don't make very much money because of drug price controls. If you're an Indian pharmaceutical company, you don't make very much money because there's very weak patent protection, and the government basically turns a blind eye to generics, just taking your product right away on day one. So I think when we think about it, there's a bunch of good reasons why the US has the leading system in the world. One is we've got a very good drug approval system, particularly through a process called PDUFA, the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, which enables much more expedited processes for drug approval. We have a strong patent system. We heard about that. We also had, and although we had some declines in FDA funding now, we just had a big NIH increase funding. NIH doubled for a while, and then it was down about 25% from doubling. So NIH funding is kind of the base at which a lot of companies build their science off of, and so that's a critical component too. And then finally, the way we do drug pricing is frankly a big key to success in the US, and meddling with that is essentially going to turn us into the European model, I think, if we go down that path.
I'd just like to, we talk a lot about patients in my company, because actually that's why we come to work every day. But I don't think we should forget the contribution that we make from an economic perspective as well to society. As I said, we've grown over the last 16 years from a couple of people to now close to 1,000. A lot of jobs have been created. We're building a manufacturing facility in order to be able to make our medicines. That again is another significant investment in the community. So if we're successful as an industry, actually, not only will we benefit patients, which is the prime purpose, but we'll also have an impact on society from a job creation perspective.
3.5
million jobs when you add up all the effects for the US economy.
And I want to take questions from the audience in a second, but first a question for you, Abbie. How do we often hear about this issue of women in STEM. How do we increase the gender diversity in this field?
Well, I think that, one of the things that might be a little bit confusing, there are the entry level in biotech and pharma, it's about 50-50. There's about 50% women and 50% men coming in at entry level positions. The divide actually starts to happen more in the executive roles. With that said, it's still important for us to be, showing from a role modeling perspective, young women who want to move into science, engineering, chemistry. We do see discrepancies, for example, in the computer sciences and in chemistry. You don't see nearly the number of women that you see, say, in biology and pharmacology. And we want to see more women coming into manufacturing and other types of areas as well. And I think that the incentive comes really, quite frankly, from showing young women that there are women in the industry. So we have to make ourselves visible, and we have to have the conversations at the very early stages of education. In Massachusetts, we have quite an active involvement in the education system when it comes to representing the industry to the young people in the school, so that we have workforce development locally, because as you know, we have the biggest life science cluster here, and we need to continue to feed that. So there's a lot of it that is just visibility of diversity in general in our industry, and making sure that people are seeing it so that they're interested in being a part of it, and they look at people and they say, oh gosh, there's people like me in that industry, I can do it.
Yeah.
It's a very tough industry. Producing a medicine actually is like, it's magic when it happens, because it's so hard, it's so long, and there's so much risk associated with it, that we have to have the best people that we can find in this endeavor. And the best people are not going to be just men. They're going to be the best of the best, and we just need to, as Abbie said, we need to encourage as many great folk to come into this industry. It's such an exciting business. It has so much opportunity to offer society, and Abbie and I will be out there doing what we can to keep flying the flag and encouraging more and more people to come in the industry, and then more importantly to stay with it.
That's great. Well, I think we have time for a couple audience questions.
Vic from the NIH. So the Lilly CEO, talked about cures for serious diseases. Then the patient told us that nobody likes to be a patient. So my question is this industry doing enough to prevent disease, or products aimed at preventing diseases rather than treating them? And if not, what can be done to change that?
I can actually take a start at that. I think it's an excellent question. Prevention and cure are something that there has been a lot of dialogue, maybe an unfortunate negative representation of our industry by saying we don't want to do those things because that will reduce the amount of money that we can make over time, because if we develop a prevention or a cure, how in the world are we going to make money off of a drug over many years? And I can't say anything more strongly than that is absolutely not true. I think the dream of most of the people who are in our industry is to understand the genetic basis of disease, the biochemical basis of disease, to the point where we can actually inch more and more closely to prevention. I think we're getting closer to cure. We heard earlier about some of the gene therapy approaches, certainly some of the things that Yvonne's company are doing. We're understanding the genetic basis of disease, which that is something that you can do that can talk to really talk to the point of prevention and possibly cure. We're investing tremendous amounts of money into developing registries of patients where we understand the diversity of the genetics that might be driving diseases such as kidney disease, which it's a huge burden, but nobody innovates in it. We have a kidney disease company that's one of very few innovating in an area that represents about 20% of our Medicare budget. So I think that we are aligning, and I think the new breakthroughs in understanding genetics and the complex systems even beyond the genetics, that's something we're investing a tremendous amount in. So I do think that there is incentive to develop prevention and cures. It's just going to take a little bit longer.
Any other questions? I have a question for you guys. What are some of the differences between the culture of big pharma and the culture, like the sort of scrappy startup culture of a biotech startup?
I suppose I should take that one.
Yeah.
You've described it very well. Look, as I said, I think large pharma by definition, they're larger organizations with lots of people. When you've got lots of people working in a company, there needs to be a little bit more process, a little bit more governance, so decision making slower. I think importantly, you generally have a little bit less ownership of what you're doing because there's so many other people doing similar things. And decision making takes a little longer, but you have incredible people who are very, very kind of capable in their areas of expertise. And I think large pharma has done a tremendous job making sure that through the global distribution that these companies have of making sure that important medicines can be made available to patients all around the world. I think you described biotech really well. Scrappy, it's nimble. And I think importantly, there's probably a little bit more individual accountability because you can see the proximity between the decisions you make and the outcomes that you have. If I was to sit back and try to sum it up in maybe one sentence, I'd say that probably large pharma, tends to have a perspective that's more around risk management, not surprisingly.
Right.
And I think the lens of biotech is much more opportunity driven. So when you have a situation, large pharma, we're thinking about, well, what if this happens or what if that happens? In biotech, I think our instinct is this could be a tremendous opportunity. How do we figure out how to access it? So I think both parties make a huge contribution to the biopharma ecosystem, and in fact we collaborate together, on a very regular basis. Alnylam may not be here in the situation that it is now and have made the progress that it has done if we hadn't effected a tremendous collaboration with Sanofi Genzyme. And I think Sanofi Genzyme wouldn't have access to the innovation that Alnylam has been able to generate if they hadn't been part of the collaboration. So I think it's great partnership and opportunities for collaboration between those two sorts of companies. I don't know, Abbie, if you've got a.
Yeah, I would just add to what Yvonne said. There is an ecosystem that is quite intentional. It starts with academic and government innovators at the NIH and in all of our major institutions. Then that sort of moves into what biotech does by translating from that academic innovation environment, sort of getting your first real concepts out there in some of the more disruptive technologies and drugs. And then we are absolutely dependent on pharma, and pharma is dependent on us when it comes to bigger indications, broader reach. We talked about the global nature of pharma versus the more local nature of biotech. That ecosystem is well established, works very, very well, and takes advantage of the cultures in each of those different settings. And our partnership with the government helps with that, whether it be from the FDA or CMS or any of the agencies that really help us understand where that innovation needs to go. So it's a very delicate balance, but one that I think is pretty finely tuned and is continuing to work well.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Abbie. Thank you for dealing with the Skype connection. And thank you, Yvonne and Rob, for being here. I appreciate it. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.